The steppe smells like winter and metal. Frost crusts the wooden pallets and the corrugated ribs of the service gantries. Under floodlights, the R-16 rises into the dark, like an idea made dangerous baralumini skin. Black stenciled Cyrillic, a capsule of heptyl and nitric acid that might, if all goes perfectly, become the first of a new generation of missiles carrying orders farther than any bomber ever could. If all goes perfectly, it is 24, October 1960 at Baikonur, a place that does not exist on any map by that name. The wind comes thin off the Karaganda plains, and everything hums amid the diesel generators, the portable flood lamps, the murmurs of men in quilted jackets and felt boots, breath smoking in tired bursts. Someone coughs, and the cough echoes inside a control bunker where a board bristles with toggles and glass fuses. A wire curls out of a junction box like a loose hair. Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin stands near the pad in a heavy coat, the kojarop a dark cap pulled down over the lines etched into his forehead. He is a man of timelines and signatures, of political gravity transmitted by telephone. 10 days until the anniversary in Moscow when men on a reviewing stand will receive gifts named Progress. He has pushed and insisted, called, and arrived early. He asks a pointed question about time and is answered in the language of technicians' minutes, Comrade Marshal. We are minutes away. He nods and does not step back. The chief designer, Mikhaili, Janghel moves. Like a man who hears the weight of each footfall, he does the math again in his head. This machine is new. The procedures are a patchwork of old habits and new demands. Hypergolic C feels the word in the back of his throat, fuel that lights when kissed by oxidizer. Propellants that don't forgive. He stands with a cluster of engineers whose faces are young, even under the winter. They smell of cold, tobacco, and solvent, of fear, disguised as concentration. Someone jokes about a cigarette. Yengel shakes his head out of reflex and then, a minute later, finds himself outside the perimeter of the work crew. Lighter in his palm, a need to breathe air that is not filtered through someone else's urgency. A habit, a superstition. Step away when the step feels impossible. Galina, the nurse from the clinic near the rail spur, moves among the support trucks with a thermos in her satchel. She hands tea, 2 hands too cold to hold it, and watches faces for the tightness that comes before a faint. She has worked flight days before, patched cracked knuckles, taped split fingers, set a wrist broken when a load shifted. This is different. People crowd the pad in numbers that make no sense to a safety plan. She does not know the words for what they are handling. AK-27I butter knows, a bitter, sweet, unsettling smell, like paint thinner and rotten almonds and something else. Something metallic that sits at the front of the sinus and doesn't leave. She tightens the scarf under her chin and finds a spot of clean snow to wipe her fingers. A 22-year-old ground technician named Sasha wedges his shoulders deeper into a service bay under the second stage. The curved armor of the missile closes over his back. He holds a flashlight in his teeth and traces a harness with his fingertips, feeling insulation crackle under cloth tape. At this improvisation with power lift. Lines hot. The procedural book if there were a single one would ban it. But the marshal is on the pad and the clock is not theirs. A senior man crouched beside him whispers, carefully, into his ear. We will isolate circuit 5. Check continuity. Reconnect. Do not touch. The igniter leads. Do not. Sasha nods, trying to tuck his elbows inward so the wool of his jacket won't snag on the forest of small, unforgiving things. A camera crew sets up near the gantry. A tripod, sinking into permafrost-softened mud that froze again after sunrise. Boris, the cameraman, checks his lens against the lights and frames the rocket so it fills the top half of the scene. The man filling the Bodemas study in scale and pride he's been told to capture. He gets the angle where the service towers slice the knife into layered rectangles. The barrel of a searchlight cutting across like a comet tail. He makes a mental note to protect the film from cold shatter. He lowers the viewfinder. He can smell that strange, stinging air from here. He writes R16 pad 41 final tests on a slate with a nub of chalk that stains his fingers. Inside the bunker, a controller named Zvoronov ticks a pencil down a column of steps he has learned by rote and by fear. First stage tanks pressurized. Second stage tanks pressurized. Pyrotechnic initiation circuits. Unarmed. He says the words aloud because saying them makes them true. The room is crowded beyond sense. Designers, officers, translators of pressure into politics. A desk creaks under the weight of men leaning, not to rest but to see. A woman from the telemetry room touches her earlobe as if she forgot an earring and knows that superstition is useless and also necessary. Outside, the frost smokes where hoses leak warmth. The gantries close and open around the R-16 like ribs expanding and contracting around a held breath. Somewhere near the base, a valve taps open, taps shut. Someone swears. Someone else answers, softly, with a soothing word that works on machines and on men. Nedelin has moved closer than anyone wants him to be. He wants to see progress, to be near the triumph when it happens, to be in the picture if the picture becomes news. He does not know end. How could he? That proximity's about to become destiny. Yangel, a cigarette he has not lit in his hand, feels that sharp prickling at the back of his neck, and tells himself, it is the steppes. He glances back toward the bunker and considers walking down into its two measuring tables and switchgear and the comforting abstraction of numbers. He looks instead at the pad, alive with moving figures like a theater before curtain. He slides the cigarette back into its crumpled pack and walks, almost absent-mindedly, toward the edge of the lights, where the dark begins. He'll take 1 minute there, he tells himself. 1 minute to pull air into the bottom of his lungs, and let urgency be someone else as 4 or 5 or 10 breaths. In the bay, Sasha's gloved fingertip brushes a connector and he hears a tiny, traitorous tick. Static. He freezes, retraces, finds the wire again. The insulation is brittle, the fabric tape damp with winter. He thinks of the precautions they skipped de-energizing the pyrotechnics. Grounding straps they did not bother with because there was no time to find them. He inhales and holds it until his lungs hurt and then lets it out through his nose very slowly. Voronov sees a phantom twitch on his panel, an indicator that should be dark flares, dull orange, and then dies. He frowns and looks to a colleague who shrugs in the particular way of a person whose life depends on not making problems out of glitches. Voronov lifts the heavy bakelite handset wired to the pad intercom, says quietly, confirm pyrotechnic circuits on the second stage are physically disconnected. The line is a hiss. A voice comes back that he cannot quite name, saying something about continuity checks, about being almost finished. If he had less discipline, he would shout. He puts the handset down with exaggerated care. Boris pans up the body of the rocket, and for a breath the machine looks like it is breathing with him. Hears a fast shout, sees 3 men down on the first-level catwalk turn as one and look outward, toward where Yangel has disappeared and where the open steppe is nothing but angle and air. He starts to turn his camera that way when his eye catches movement very close, very small. A glimmer of vapor at a flange, an impossible sparkle of frost inside steam, a rivulet of something that smokes when it touches steel. Galina feels the sting all at once, like a citrus peel squeezed into the eyes of the evening. The air tastes like battery acid. She swallows and the swallow scrapes her throat raw. She can't place it beyond the word bad. She takes 1 step toward the ambulance and another toward the pad and stops, indecisive in the gap between instinct and order. She hears laughter somewhere, sharp with nerves. Nedelin leans over the guardrail of the service platform, his boot tapping, the cap rim throwing shade over his eyes. He is waiting for the moment he will be told to move to the viewing line so he can watch history behave. He is waiting for someone to tell him what he wants to hear. He is not waiting long. In the bay, Sasha's lamp flickers as if a sheet has been thrown over the sun. He tastes copper. The connector in his fingers vibrates as something far away and very near changes state from safe to armed to something else, a category that has never been named because it should never exist. Voices layer over voices. The slow mechanical belly of the gantry creaks and then stills. A tiny click, not the type that carries. The smell like someone struck a match a kilometer away. A whisper of flame blooms where no flame should be under the second stage engine bell. A pale tongue at first, then a cough, then a blowtorch. Sasha opens his mouth to scream and all the air in the world turns to fire. Light erases shape. A hemisphere of flame punches outward and downward and then seems to fold back on itself. A flower blooming in a heartbeat and seeding the pad with burning leaves. Hypergolic fuel heptametes. red fuming nitric acid in quantities the eye cannot understand, and becomes a single substance: heat. The second stage engine, never meant to light here, Antegrant has ignited like a fuse stuck into a powder magazine. The stream incinerates everything beneath it in a disk, and then the tanks above pressurized. Brimming surrender their skins in a groan too low to hear over the roar. The first stage tanks ruptured with a wet, apocalyptic sigh. A firebolt climbs the service towers. Paint bubbles off steel. Aluminum softens and runs. The gantries act as chimneys, and then as blades, scything through men who try to run but have nowhere to run to. Fencing that kept spectators back becomes a trap. Fluids atomize into a mist that corrodes lungs and finds the wet parts of eyes and mouths, and punishes them for being open. Screams shear into the sound of a furnace. Yangle, at the edge of the light, is thrown to the ground. The heat touches him like a slap even from where he is, outside the immediate circle of hell, and then the shock of what has happened crashes into him like a second wave. His brain, trained to decomposition and causality, whispers something about a cross-connection, a spark, a harness His body pulls itself crabwise behind a truck, eyes filled with boiling light, breath ragged with terror and guilt, so clean it feels like truth. Off to the side, a man who had been beside him a minute ago is not there. The space occupied by light alone. Galina runs toward the fire because there is no part of her setup to run away. The first men she reaches are already beyond help. She knows this, not because she has seen anything like this before, but because there is a kind of stillness that belongs to the dead, and she recognizes it in the way their knees fail. She throws herself to a man whose jacket still smokes, slapping at wool that will not stop burning, pulling him up and away from the pad as the heat sears the hairs on her wrist. A second explosion, smaller, flings metal like a handful of coins. Something invisible bites the back of her neck. She keeps moving. She has mouths to close and airways to clear and hands to hold. Inside the bunker, glass beads and control panels melt and run like sugar. Vornov's world turns white and then orange. The boards he tended flee from him and he finds himself under a table and then on his knees, and then a voice, his or someone else's, is shouting, "This is nitric acid. Cover your face." Your face. A rag that was a scarf becomes a mask he presses to his mouth. The room is a boil. Men trying to be small in a place that wants to make them nothing. A door jams, and then gives, in a flood of human bodies, spills into air that punishes lungs for wanting more of it. On the pad, people who were up high on platforms found themselves without stairs. A ladder melts down its rungs. Men jump from 3-4 meters, and their bones complain and then are ignored because the only fact now is that the ground between them and any other place is burning. A cable basket that has no business being a lifeboat becomes one, swinging on a charred wire while hands fight to fit too many into it. In a far corner, the missile's skin collapses like a tent whose pole has been kicked out. The sound becomes a low, river light rushing as propellant that did not burn right away drains into a trench and hisses there, a caustic creak eating into concrete. Boris's camera, still on its tripod, captures the first 3 seconds of the catastrophe with indifference. The film emulsion takes the light the way a field takes rain. Greedily, then dumbly. When the shockwave reaches the camera, it smashes the viewfinder like a toy. Boris is thrown backward, lands hard, and is on his feet, in the act of falling, hands up, over a face he will later fail to recognize in a mirror. He staggers toward the truck where he keeps spare mag, some part of him already guarding the record of what he has seen, knowing that whether or not anyone will ever be allowed to look, the world must be held accountable to the image. He feels his eyebrows sizzle and smells singed hair, and closes his eyes for one step, and opens them again, because closed eyes are an invitation to stop forever. Sasha does not feel pain at first. He feels light, 10 pressures, then a weight on his chest as if he has been packed in earth. He coughs, and the cough brings fire into his mouth. Someone's hand finds his wrist and gropes for a pulse. He thinks of his mother's kitchen, of the enamel pot that rattled when the neighbor's boy thumped down the stairs. He thinks a ridiculous thing. "I did not touch the igniter lead." He tries to say it, and his mouth makes a sound like a leaking valve. Nedelin is gone here, then not. Men will argue for years about the instant, whether he was lifted whole and dropped like a toy, or erased in situ by a heat that saw rank and did not care. The official line will speak in passive voice and accidents. The pad will remember a human shape only in negative. Shadows on steel where paint protected by presence did not burn as the sun printed bodies onto Hiroshima's walls. But now in the flare and the smoke, what matters is that the center of gravity of this day has shifted from triumph to tragedy in one breath, and the men who look around for orders find only each other. The clinic fills in a run. Galina and 2 others turn beds that were meant for sprains into stretchers. Water is a question. Too much, and the chemical burns revive. Too little and nothing is washed away. The air inside stings eyes and throats. Outside is worse. Masks are improvised from gauze, then from shirts, torn away from faces that need air more than they need modesty. An orderly vomits and apologizes, and goes back to work. The commandant of the base walks in with suit from ear to ear, nods once, and says what is in his power. All vehicles to the pad. Drivers with handkerchiefs tied over their faces never mind the rules about contaminated. The sky flames dusk to true dark, and the heat paints the underside of the smoke orange. Somewhere a siren starts and has nowhere to point its noise. The field telephone at the clinic desk rings and rings again, and when someone catches it, a voice with hierarchies all through it instructs, "Names will not be written in any report. This is an incident of a sort we do not discuss." The nurse listening puts the receiver down very gently and then picks it up again and says, "Without love for the consequence, we will need more saline than we have. We will need doctors from Leninsk. We will need..." She is still listing needs when the line goes dead. At the edge of the pad, Yangel stares through heat distortion at the place where the second stage bell still glows. He feels the story start to write itself in the back of his head. Troubleshooting with propulsion systems armed. No ordnance safety pins installed in a test that should never have included any pyro in a live condition. A control board not built to make it impossible for a spark to leak into the wrong wire. He wants, even now, to stand before a blackboard and draw an arrow labeled cause. He is dragged back into the present by a soldier shoving a canteen into his hand. "Drink," the soldier says, and it is an order and a mercy. The winter wind, Sukasitis, fails to clear the air. Acid vapors settle low, hugging the ground, flowing like water into low places where men have fallen and are still breathing. Those who stand tallest breathe least of it. Those who crawl and drag breathe most. Galina realizes this with a chill and begins to shout, hoarse already, to tell the rescuers to keep their heads high, to lift the faces of the ones they pull. She does not know if anyone can hear over the shee of the ongoing burn, the unstoppable sound of reaction. In the bunker, Voronov's perfect lists are ash on the floor. He finds a pencil in his pocket and writes on his palm without knowing why. Time, cause, names. He will wash it away before the night is over and still feel the impression of graphite in his skin for days. He steps out into air that bites his eyes as if with claws, and for a second he considers stepping back in and closing the door and pretending the world is a set of panels again. He goes forward because there is nowhere else to go. The fire shrinks itself down out of spectacular and into lethal persistence, into pockets and puddles, into hot spots that spring to life when someone feeds them oxygen. Men with sand and foam fight glittering little devils that dance away from every shovel. In the black edge of the pad, an ambulance reverses, tires squealing, and the driver's hands shake so hard on the wheel that the steering seems to have a mind of its own. He breathes through his handkerchief and counts backwards from 100 because someone in the army taught him once that counting can be a bridge back to calm. All night, the glow pushes against the darkness. In the morning, the wind will shift and bring back to the pad the smell of what the pad has made. For now, under a sky that seems unconcerned, a line of rescuers in coats stiff with frost and acid makes for the clinic, then returns, then makes for the clinic again, the step thudding under boots. The horizon, a cold, indifferent, straight line. At first light, the pad looks like the inside of a burned kettle. Steel chevrons lean like broken ribs. The missile is now an absence with edges. Crumpled ladders curl like dead leaves. Footprints and soot lead to holes in fences and stop where the heat erased feet. The snow that fell in a flurry before dawn turned to gray slush and then to a treacherous skin of ice, freezing what the evening sent down as vapor onto breathing stones and metal. Men move as if they are walking on words they must not say. The clinic smells of antiseptic, iodine, and something metallic that belongs to nitric acid. Galina's hands are a map of small burns and bruises. She does not look at them. She moves from bed to stretcher, from stretcher to floor, prioritizing by pulse and pupils. Chemical burns appear late. The skin looks whole, and the lungs are not. She has learned in hours what she should have learned over months. Wash and wash again. Do not bind tightly. Do not seal an acid under clean bandage. She sends a boy with ears too big for his head running for more water. For the last sealed bag of saline. For scissors sharp enough to save a hand from a glove that holds it hostage. Sasha wakes and sleeps and wakes. His world is a white ceiling stained brown in one corner, and Galina's face above it, and the jolt of being moved. He asks a question with his eyes, and she answers with her hand. Covering for a second his fingers where the nails have black edge. He blinks and sees shadows of shapes that might be coworkers and might be strangers. He coughs, and the cough brings pain. He takes the pain because taking it means he is still something the clinic can work on. Outside, a ring of men in long coats appears as if the wind blew them in together. The State Commission arrives. Engineers with their hair slicked flat. Officers with faces that learn to be indifferent in rooms where the walls listen. A mathematician whose hands never stop moving as if he is smoothing an equation flat and turning it over again and again. A sedan sits with its engine running, exhaust steaming. A phone in the back seat connected by wire to a switchboard miles away. The driver stares straight ahead and measures minutes and cigarettes. Nedelin's absence moves like a shockwave through the base and then out along cables to Moscow and into rooms where language itself has been arranged to blunt this kind of blow. In the absence, a script rises. There has been an incident. The formal lie is quick and clean. A plane crash takes the marshal in the line of duty. The path the truth will take is longer. Patient, stubborn as a leak. It will crawl under doors, stick to boots, smudge ink, yangle, sleepless and sober. Stands before the commission and answers questions with the voice of a man who went out to smoke and came back to a physics experiment that ate his friends. He does not prevaricate. He does not yet know what precise mistake started it, but he names the family of mistakes. Work on a partially armed vehicle. Circuits that should have been inhibited were not. A pyrotechnic igniter did the only thing it knows how to do when asked by voltage. The second stage engine lit. The ground is no place for that to happen. He says this without raising his voice. He says my responsibility and means it in a way that makes even officers shift their feet. The commission walks the pad in rubber boots that stick to the ground with obscene kisses. They bend to pick up fragments and put them down quickly when they discover that the metal burns cold. A hand points and a pencil traces. An arc in the air. The stream must have gone here. It would have atomized here. The first stage tanks would have ruptured here and here. A young engineer whose name will not be recorded gestures helplessly at a place where a knot of steel pins and safety flags lie in a pile like someone dropped a metal bouquet and could not pick it up again. He does not say what is obvious to everyone who looks. These should have been elsewhere, in the air that blows through the bunkers. Words like procedures and safety take on the weight of funerals. The Soviet program built its miracles in a Yuri Gagarin. Will fly soon, and the world will watch a smiling man step out of a small ball and change the meaning of possible. But here, at this pad, hurry has turned into its own weather. The commission hears about phone calls made too late, about interlocks that did not exist, about a culture that prized spleen quickness over caution. Voluntarism, someone says in a voice drawn tight as wire, naming the swaggering optimism of a political moment that thinks the calendar can be bullied into compliance. In Deklinik, Ellis starts on a piece of paper torn from a ledger. Names, if names can be had. Descriptions, when faces resist recognition. A man with a jaw like a granite block. Writes carefully. Height, a scar at the left temple. A ring with Cyrillic letters. He pauses between lines to stare at nothing. Galina forgets her own name for a second when someone asks for it for a form. She writes Galina, and lets others fill in her patronymic. The queue at the door shifts bodies and hope in ragged waves as wives and mothers arrive with scarves pulled up over their noses. They ask questions and hear answers that sound like static. Boris sits on an overturned crate with his hands tucked under his armpits to warm them and tries to remember where he has hidden the magazines he managed to save. He has learned the rhythms of confiscation and knows better than to announce what he has. He looks at his assistant, a boy with a downy mustache and a burn blossoming on his cheek, and thinks for a mad instant about taking the film and walking east into the steppe, keeping going until he finds a place where truth is not dangerous. He does not move. He hears in his head the sound the camera made in the first 3 seconds, and wonders what the world will sound like when it is all quiet. At the edge of the pad, a small ceremony takes place, hidden in motion. A sergeant gathers the watches from 3 bodies and puts them in a cloth bag. He does this with care, as if he is undressing a sleeping child, and ties the bag shut with a knot he learned from his grandfather. He will carry it to an office where someone will decide what time they all stopped, and whether that matters. A number takes shape and then squirms and slides away. 70, 90, 116, 120, and more. The count refuses to settle because the list is incomplete, because not everyone signed in, because men from other pads came to see the historic test and did not tell anyone, because absence is harder to count than presence. The tally will enter the city as rumor in the pockets of men who stand as straight for too long at their kitchen tables, and in the eyes of women counting the way grief folds itself around the invisible. In the afternoon, a general stands and says, "We will continue." The words are cold comfort to the living, and a kind of insult to the dead, and also, at some spinal level, a thing the living must hear. The R-16 program will not end here. It will be redesigned. Interlocks will be built to make the wrong thing physically impossible. Ranges will be cleared of men before tests that involve anything beyond breath. The names of those who stood on the pad will be carved somewhere later. For now, they are written on a chalkboard that leans against a wall that still smells of acid. Yengel goes back to his office and locks the door and bends over a notebook. He sketches a circuit. He writes, underlines, then scratches out, then writes again. He remembers the flame blooming in a place where no flame should be, and the way his feet moved on their own. He thinks of Nedelin not as a marshal, but as a man in a hat leaning over a rail. He puts the hat into the drawing in the corner without meaning to. A black wedge that looks like a symbol and maybe is Sasa. Sleeps. In his sleep, he runs a wire through his fingers and keeps it from touching anything it should not. Again and again until the wire is smooth with handling. The steppe holds its silence like a grudge. A week passes, and the pad is scraped clean of what can be scraped. Trucks haul away pieces of metal bent into corkscrews by heat. The sharp patterns on concrete are read like hieroglyphs by men who teach themselves how to make a new religion of caution. A simple sign is bolted to a post at the edge of the site. Entry with respirators only. It looks ridiculous under the big sky and is necessary. The funerals are both public and not. Officially, the marshals and general designers are mourned for different reasons, in different places. Men in suits speak of revolutionary labor and tragic accidents, and the slag pits of industry and in the skies. The word Baikonur is not pronounced. In Leninsk, and at the pad's own little cemetery, bodies are laid in frost-stiff soil under numbers that will acquire names in a few years, and full histories only decades later. Galina stands off to the side in her second-best coat and feels a throb of pain that starts behind her eyes and radiates outward into the world until all of it is one continuous ache. She watches a boy take off his hat and hold it to his chest with both hands as if it will run away. Inside a warm room that hums with a coal stove and the weight of consequence, the State Commission writes, "The report is a strange hybrid of science and so it enumerates facts. During the preparation for the first flight test of the R-16 missile on LAC-41, measures envisaged by the regulations to preclude unintended activation of pyrotechnic devices were not carried out. The presence of senior officials at the launch complex and pressure to accelerate the schedule created conditions conducive to violations. The second stage engine ignited prematurely as a result of a short circuit and/or improper testing procedure, leading to catastrophic failure of the first stage fuel tanks. It recommends design interlocks, procedural safeguards, evacuation of non-essential personnel during hazardous operations. A culture of halt when any technical ambiguity arises. It names what it can and leaves the rest to silence. The political apparatus dresses the wound. A task brief goes out about a plane crash, a tragedy in the line of duty. Newspapers print photographs without dates. In the city, people who know count the columns of type and read the gaps between words, the way others read the sky for weather. In kitchens, names are whispered because to speak them loud feels like inviting attention, and to not speak them feels like betrayal. The paradox tightens the muscles along the spine. The language grows curlicues to get around what cannot be said. At the pad, a routine emerges with the stubborn inevitability of frost. New procedures are drilled, not dry, but with pressure in the lines and the living memory of breath that turned to fire. A red-painted set of safety flags hangs heavy on the wall. A sign says, "Who may remove them?" The person who installed them, escorted by someone not under scheduled pressure. A young lieutenant walks with his hands behind his back like a and asks quiet questions. Show me where the interlocks. Break the circuit. Show me the place. The electricity cannot jump. Engineers who have slept little for weeks answer with a patience they did not know they possessed. Yangol descends into the details. He sits with men whose faces he has known for years, and they argue not about blame but about resistors and grounds, about connector bushes and pyrotechnic bridges, about the way a virtual path can become a real path when the air is dry and a man in a wool coat slides across a metal step and discharges what he carries into a wire that did not ask for it. He's granular, obsessive. He fights political interventions with a machine made of specifics. Here's the diagram, and here is why it must be so. Schedule must respect the path of electrons. Sasha heals. In increments, he wakes one morning to find he can smell tea again. Not just the ghost of acid that haunted his sinuses. He also smells the oil on the clinic floor and a wedge of soap that sits on the sink like a sacrament. He sits up without someone lifting him. He dreams less often of the glow under the second stage bell and more often of a future that includes work, slow work, and a return to the pad when the pad is a different kind of place. Galina, bending to check him, sees this in the way he reaches for his cup and does not have to hide the tremor in his hand. She allows herself a small, private smile. Boris is called into an office where a man he has never seen before sits behind a desk that does not match the room. The man asks for the film. Boris produces a case, and then a second case, and is surprised to discover he does not need to pretend not to care. The man writes a receipt on paper that already knows the names of the parties involved. We may use it to learn, the man says, the passive voice doing work for which it was born. He cannot promise Boris that anyone will ever see the frames he risked his eyes to capture. Boris nods and leaves, and goes home and sits on a stool in a kitchen where the wallpaper peels, listening to the sound of his wife making soup, and thinks that the images will outlive him whether or not they see a screen. In Moscow, the man whose politics demanded miracles on anniversaries listens to a report that does not name the place where it happened. Khrushchev hears about a catastrophe and about the forging ahead. He asks, after Yangol and after the R-16, he asks whether the Americans know. He is told no and yes, and that secrecy is safe and not safe. He approves expenditures for warning systems and for nothing to be said that need not be. He hangs up the phone and taps his finger on a map that shows nothing of the steppe. Winter is a discipline. Men go to the pad in dark and come home in dark and measure progress in markings on a checklist and in the way their muscles. Remember the weight of a wrench. The first stage is rebuilt. The second stage is treated like a live animal even when it is cold. A set of tests produces nothing but boredom and relief, and a joke that draws breath back into the room. Galina stands at the edge of the clinic S-yard and watches the sky for cloud and for omens, and finds herself standing straighter. When she hears that an engine test ran and shut down without drama, on a windless, sharp morning in late January, a drill is held with all the choreography of flight day, but none of the electricity. The pad is cleared of the unnecessaries, which turns out to be almost everyone but the panel in the bunker and the men perched carefully on the edge of necessity. The marshal's cap is not there to be leaned over a rail. The weight of that absence is a thing between the crew and the machine. They put their hands in their pockets and take them back out and find other ways to stand. In a tent strung with warming lights, Yangol reads the line that marks the place where the interlock will break the circuit if it is ever asked to again. He rests a finger on the schematic, and then lifts that hand and lies it flat on the paper as if to bless it. He tells himself a story about cause and effect that has the shape of redemption. Out beyond the canvas wall, the wind shifts and brings with it the smell of something clean. Snow. He steps outside and lets flakes sting his cheeks. There is work to do that will never be finished. He knows. And there is also a day when the missile will light its engines in the place designed for that to happen and rise. Everything waits on a morning. The dawn is the pale blue of enamel. The pad under the frost is unrecognizably orderly. The gantries are stripped back and locked. The bunker is not crowded. The checklist is printed clean and reads like a story to be believed. On the 2nd of February 1961, a pair of first stage engines on an R-16 breathe flame in the right place at the right time, and the ground shakes with controlled intention. The machine rises, fire pouring into trenches designed for fire, the brackets letting go on purpose. The plume becomes a pillar and then a brush stroke into the high air. The white steam condenses. Then tattered fragments blow east. Into bunker no one cheers at first. Voronov waits for a number to settle, for a tone to hit its range, for the graph to climb smooth. When it does, he lets out a sound like laughter that embarrasses him. He slaps the back of the man next to him, and that man takes the slap like water after a march. A call comes in from a tracking station downrange. Clipped and calm, the vowels standing at attention. Telemetry nominal. Telemetry nominal. Telemetry nominal. The words are consecration. On a hill that could be any of 5 in sight, Galina stands with a cluster of technicians and a driver chewing a matchstick, their hats flapped down over ears, their hands deep in pockets. They feel the ground's low frequency thrill and watch the flame climb while the sound arrives later, a slow thunder that licks the ribs. No one says what they all think about where they were when it was not this. A woman crosses herself and then stops, startled at her own reflex, and lets her hand fall and become a wave of blessing. When the dot at the top of the plume becomes sky, they look at each other with that rare expression of permitted satisfaction. Then, because this is Baikonur, they turn and go back to work. The Commission's recommendations become hardware and habit. Safety pins are real, red things that cannot be ignored. Placards go up in hangars and block letters that are practical poetry. Do not energize with pyro connected. Test leaves installed. These phrases become incantations, muttered as men put their hands where wires live. Interlocks become physical bridges, burned in if necessary. A new office is empowered to say no when hurry is the only argument. It is not perfect. Nothing built of humans is, but the distance between what happened and what could happen again grows and grows, measurable in procedures and in seconds of quiet between callouts. The dead are given a place. A modest monument rises at the Cosmodrome, granite polished until it throws winter light back at winter sky. Names, when they can be named, are carved. Others are represented by anonymous lines, the absence acknowledged in stubborn stone. Wreaths appear on anniversaries that most calendars pretend are for other things. Men in coats stand and do not speak for a stretch long enough that breath becomes a metronome. The wind shivers the ribbon. Years later, after other tragedies and triumphs, more people will visit who were not alive when it happened, and they will leave quiet, as if a place can ask for that. Boris's film sleeps in a vault for almost 3 decades. When Glasnost loosens the fists around certain truths, frames are threaded through a projector in a screening room full of men whose hair has thinned and gone gray. The projector's hum fills the gaps left by words choked back. Light throws the old pad onto a white screen. The first 3 seconds before the blast are enough to take breath away even for those who live those days. The flash that follows fills the room not just with light, but with a return of heat that does not exist there. The news program that eventually airs. The sequence shapes its narrative, carefully. The courage of those who return to drag the living from acid fog. The errors of a system that thought schedules were physics. The changes wrought. People stand in their kitchens and watch history that was always there become visible. The official phrase Nedelin catastrophe enters print. In conversations, the story leans away from gossip and toward memory. The widow of a man who died on the pad stands under a portrait and touches the glass for reasons too many and too simple to list. Children hear what their fathers could not say when they were small and decide for themselves whether this kind of work is a calling or a caution. The secret grows up into a history with contour and tone. Yangel does not live to see the film aired. He dies in 1971, his reputation complicated and formidable. Designer of robust things that fly, bearer of a fire that burned on his watch. In rooms where rockets are born, his name is a weight more than an admonition, a reminder that genius is no substitute for procedure. The R-16 and its descendants stand on alert for decades. A deterrent written in telltale plumes of breath and cold air near silos and fields where wheat grows indifferent. Men with keys and safes remember the men on the pad when they practice. Sasha, older with a scar on his wrist shaped like a question mark, becomes the kind of technician who notices when someone reaches for a switch with the wrong hand. He clears rooms with his voice calmly. He's respected for not raising it. He keeps a tiny length of cloth tape in a drawer, brittled with time, and shows it to no one. On the morning of a test, many years later, he pauses on the threshold of a bunker and places a palm flat against the frame, recognizing in the cool, smooth concrete the possibility that something that has been made can be made safer. Galina, who left the clinic only to return when called, trains nurses who have never smelled nitric acid and hopes they never will. She drills them hard and checks their hands for tremor and sends them home when their eyes grow glassy with fatigue. She tells them one story only. In an emergency, we start where we stand. Everything else can be summoned later. She keeps a kind of vigil for men and women who have trouble sleeping when the wind hammers the hospital windows. She knows what the wind can sound like when you have heard it rehearse disaster. In the years that follow, the Cosmodrome knows other griefs and flames that bloom in other shapes. A Vostok rocket at Plesetsk in 1980 explodes during fueling and takes 48 lives. A shock that feels like an echo. Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 11 carve their names in air and in stone through different kinds of failure. Each time, a commission writes a report that tries to balance human error and mechanical inevitability and the tendency of systems to drift toward hazard when not disciplined by constant attention. Each time, a memory of the pad on the 24th of October tightens hands on ladders and pencils on checklists. Secrecy protected pride and also prevented learning. The bridge between those truths is the ground where safety is built. In the decades after the vault opens, the Soviet and then Russian and global programs build a habit of studying catastrophe with the lights on. NASA reads the Nedelin report when it can, as NASA's reports on Apollo 1 and Challenger and Columbia are read in Moscow. And across political divides, there is a fraternity of the Chasand. The understanding that wishes do not change chemistry, that scheduled pressure is not a range safety device, that the absence of disaster is not proof of safety, only of luck. At Baikonur, the wind writes the same line across the steppe every day. The pad has been rebuilt and repurposed. Men and women wear different badges now and carry phones that would have seemed like magic to Boris with his magazines and his mittens. And yet, when a vehicle rolls out, there is a swallow of breath held in the same place behind the sternum where humans have always held it. The gantries open their arms and step away. The countdown calls are calm. The flame blooms where it should, and the rocket lifts, and people lift their eyes like a reflex made devotional. There's a memorial service each October at the stone that remembers a day it does not name. On the 24th, a small knot of people gathers. Some of them were not born. Some of them were there and do not say. A trumpet plays a few notes that do not resolve because some chords don't. Names are read, and some lines are left blank. A wreath is set down by a man in a scarf, and the bough flutters against the granite. The wind carries the sound away. Behind them, in a museum on base, the first page of a report under glass says in block type, the date and a title that has grown frank, and a long list of recommendations. Visitors read and go quiet. Sometimes a child asks a question, why? And an adult answers, because we can learn. History is not a straight line. It's a spiral rising around fixed points of sorrow and success. On Steppe, under that cruel, clear sky, the fixed point of the 24th of October 1960 stands. Around its spiral, the lessons that keep hands safe and rockets flying. The discipline of halting when a small light flickers. The courage to admit that triumph is not owed to those who are in a hurry. The dead are held in memory, not to anchor the living to the pad, but to give them the firmness underfoot to step away from the wrong wire and toward the right launch. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more true events that change the world.